So we've mentioned some things that can influence allele frequency and genotype frequency, including genetic drift, including gene flow. But of these, the one that most consistently causes adaptive evolution is natural selection. So mutations can lead to new alleles, but natural selection can, it's a selection process. It's a way of amplifying useful alleles and eliminating deleterious or harmful alleles. So natural selection brings about adaptive evolution by acting on an organism's phenotype, but the basis of that is from its genotype. Now, what does it mean to be fit? So Darwin in his book talks about the struggle for existence. He did not say survival of the fittest. That is not Darwin's term. However, a lot of people think this is what natural selection is all about: survival of the fittest. But it's kind of a circular argument. What does it mean to be fit? Fitness is really a measure of who survives and reproduces. I have two problems with this expression, survival of the fittest. The one is that it's circular. Who is fit? The one who survives. Who survives? The one who is fit. So survival of the fittest is really kind of like saying survival of the survivors. The other issue I have with it is that survival of the fittest suggests that only the best of the best are going to leave offspring. But really, you could just as easily frame fittest as being fit enough. If you are fit enough to leave offspring, you are, by definition, fit. So reproductive success is dependent on many factors. So there are many ways that natural selection can affect phenotypic characters within a population. In general, we say there are three modes of selection. There can be directional selection, which is going to favor individuals at one end of the phenotypic range; disruptive, which may affect individuals at extremes of phenotypic range; or stabilizing selection, which is going to eliminate extremes of a phenotype and favor the intermediate variants. So I think a better way to understand these is by looking at some pictures. Okay, so let's say we've got a population of mice, and they vary in a particular phenotypic character, which is coat color. So they vary from kind of whitish gray to more melanistic, dark brown, black, and everything in between, different shades of brown and tan. Now, in directional selection, we could say, what if there was some influence on the population that suddenly being a particular color morph was more selective? What if having a darker color morph was more selective because of changes in the environment? The original population, the majority of individuals may have been in this color range, but if being darker became more advantageous, we would see a shift in the distribution of the color morphs towards darker. And this is a directional selection event going from this peak to this peak. Disruptive selection would be if somehow both the very light and the very dark mice were selected for, and the in-between mice were selected against. So the middle of the peak would go down, and we'd get this sort of bimodal distribution, or this two-hump distribution. That would be disruptive selection. But what if another type of event occurred, or change in the habitat occurred, which meant that being this in-between color was the absolute most advantageous, and that these mice left the most offspring? Well, maybe the ends of the phenotypic gradient would be eliminated through time, and you'd get a higher proportion of these mid-sized or mid-colored mice, and that would be stabilizing selection. So directional selection, disruptive selection, stabilizing selection. So natural selection is really the thing that drives adaptive evolution, that makes populations better suited to their particular habitat. So we can see that some very interesting examples of natural selection have occurred. Color change in cuttlefish and other cephalopods like squids and octopuses. Jaws of snakes that unhinge to allow them to eat prey that are larger than their heads. Mimic octopus, another type of mollusk. How did they get to be that way? Because natural selection has increased the frequency of the alleles that enable them to survive and reproduce. The alleles that confer fitness to the bearer. So this enables adaptive evolution to create a match between an organism and its environment. So as the match between the organism and its environment is honed, we see adaptive evolution occurring. But if the environment changes, what is adaptive in one situation may not be adaptive in another. So genetic drift and gene flow certainly do happen. However, they do not necessarily lead to adaptive evolution. They do not necessarily make for a match between an organism and its environment. They may increase the match between an organism and an environment, but just as likely they will decrease the match between an organism and their environment. A whole other factor that, or stipulation of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, is random mating. Random mating in animals rarely occurs, so far as we know. We know that there is often a degree of sexual selection, that organisms choose who they're going to mate with. This leads to things like sexual dimorphism, meaning that the two sexes have very different characteristics. We can easily recognize who is a male and who is a female within a certain species. Peacocks are a stunning example of this. Here we've got a peacock with his brilliant bluish plumage around his head and neck, and then this big spray of brightly colored, gaudy feathers that are all there for him to attract the attention of this peahen over here, who's much less gaudy in appearance, more of a dun color to her. Now, we know that there is a lot of variation, a lot of mutations out there that are what we call neutral. Neutral means that these genetic variations do not necessarily confer advantage or disadvantage to the bearer of that particular gene. But there are a number of mechanisms that help preserve genetic variation in a population. This includes being diploid, as well as different types of balancing selection. Heterozygote advantage and frequency-dependent selection being two examples of types of balancing selection. So we know that we are all diploid, as all animals are, and for at least part of the life cycle of plants, they are also diploid. Diploidy helps maintain genetic variation because you can hide certain alleles that are recessive. And if you're a heterozygote, you have recessive alleles, you may not see that phenotype. So you can hide potentially damaging recessive alleles through being diploid. Balancing selection means that you can have a type of selection where it is most adaptive to have more than two or more phenotypic forms within a population. So this can include heterozygote advantage and frequency-dependent selection. So for heterozygote advantage, what this means is if you are a heterozygote, you have some type of advantage over both of the homozygous states. So natural selection is going to maintain both of the alleles in a population, although it may have to do it in a somewhat indirect fashion. So with sickle cell trait, the sickle cell allele, we know heterozygotes have the advantage of not having sickle cell disease, or the most severe form of the sickle cell disease, but they do have some resistance to malaria. So if you're homozygous for the wild type hemoglobin, you're more likely to get malaria. But if you're homozygous for the recessive case, then sickle cell trait can be quite debilitating, which means the best way to be in areas where malaria is endemic is to be a heterozygote. And we can see that the frequency of the sickle cell allele seems to match pretty well with the distribution of the malaria parasite, Plasmodium falciparum. In frequency-dependent selection, the fitness of one phenotype or another phenotype may be dependent on exactly how many individuals have that particular phenotype in a population. Another way of saying that is that frequency-dependent selection is kind of like the hipster selection. If something becomes too abundant in a population, it is no longer adaptive. If something is rare in a population, there may be some selective pressure to maintain that allele, but once it becomes too frequent, then there's selection pressure against it, which makes that allele become more rare again. So selection can favor whichever phenotype is less popular or less common in a population. So, one example, there is a species of parasitic fish, a fish that eats from the left side of other fishes, is a scale parasite, and one that eats from the right side of these fishes. So they can come in the left-mouthed and right-mouthed morphs, because they come up and they attach to these fish and parasitize them. Now, if you have all of one type of fish, then the hosts are going to be better able to resist them. If you have too many of the right-mouthed kind, the fish are going to be able to, the host fish are going to be able to get rid of them. So what this means is that there has to be a balance between having enough left-mouthed and right-mouthed fish in this species so that no one type predominates and that both kinds can parasitize these other fish. So we can see that there's this oscillation between left-mouthed and right-mouthed fishes, and it all kind of hovers around a 50-50 ratio. So natural selection does not produce perfect organisms. It does improve the match between organisms and their environment. But no organism is perfectly matched to its environment for a number of reasons. One, selection can only act on the variation that is there. Selection does not make rates of mutation increase or decrease. Mutations that arise can only be acted upon once they are present. It's not like the antibiotic-resistant Staphylococcus aureus evolved because there was a need for it. That variation was already present and was exaggerated by the selective pressure. So evolution is limited by historical constraints. So what may have been adapted in a previous era may not be the same thing that's adaptive in the current era. But if if an allele gets fixed, if an allele goes extinct in a population, there's nothing to be done about it. So evolution can be limited by historical constraints. Adaptations are often compromises, like for example with a sickle cell allele. Having sickle cell disease is terrible. It is not something that one would choose to have. But having malaria resistance is also is favorable. So it's a trade-off. And there is an interaction between natural selection and chance, things like genetic drift and gene flow, and a changing environment that make what is adaptive in one context not necessarily what's going to be adaptive in all contexts.